Thank you for staying with me. We're now turning to a new novel called The Mirrored World, and it is by Debra Dean. It's her second novel. Great novel. It brings her characters back into Russia, where her first novel, The Madonnas of Leningrad, was set. And Debra Dean was in this area last week. Unfortunately, she's not going to be back again for a little bit. But, Debra, it's still a pleasure to have you with me on Artbeat. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Karen. My pleasure.
So you launched off on your book tour for this, your second novel, and you were indeed in Seattle last week, as we mentioned, in Bellingham and so on. How is the public receiving The Mirrored World to date?
Well, I think pretty well. I try not to pay too close attention to it because if I'm watching sales figures and all of that, it makes me crazy. I mean, my job was to write the book, and I did that.
Let's talk.
I'm enjoying being out with audiences.
Right, which must be a nice thing to sort of get out and actually be in touch with your public, because being a writer is a pretty solitary occupation for the most part.
It is. I teach, and so that gets me out of my solitude at least once a week, and I get out and talk with my students.
Talk about yourself as a writer. Have you always been a writer, would you say, or is it something you came to later?
Oh, it's not at all. It's something I came to later. I was always a bookworm. I was always a reader. But what I read when I was a child were things that were written in, the 19th century. And Emily Bronte and Little House on the Prairie books and Little Women. All of these books that were, the authors had long been dead. And so I didn't even know that author was still a viable profession. I figured it had long since passed me by. It never even occurred to me to be a writer. So my first life, I chose a more practical route. I was an actor in New York. I was in New York for about 10 years working on the stage.
And now you moved on to being an author, and your first book was called The Madonnas of Leningrad. Tell us a little bit about that one first.
Well, it's the main character is an 82-year-old Russian emigre living in the Northwest, and she's in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And so she spends a lot of her mental time not in the present moment, but in the distant past, and specifically in 1941 Leningrad, Russia, where she was a guide in the Hermitage Museum at the beginning of World War II.
And then in The Mirrored World, of course, you are back in Russia. Again, what is your connection to Russia, if you have one specifically, that keeps taking you back there for your novels?
If there is one, I don't know what it is. My husband says I was Russian in a former life, and I think that's as good an explanation as any. There isn't another one that I know of. I don't speak Russian. I don't read Russian. It's not in my heritage. When I was writing The Madonnas of Leningrad, I had never even set foot in Russia. But Russia has the best stories.
And have you since been to Russia? I mean, was it somewhere that you went before you wrote The Mirrored World, for example?
I went to Russia for the first time. I know this sounds crazy, but I went to Russia the first time after my publisher had bought The Madonnas of Leningrad. And I was so excited, especially since I saw that they were really planning on putting it out in a big way. But there was also that neurotic part of my brain that I thought, oh my gosh, this book is going out in the world, and I'm going to be discovered for a fraud because I've never even been there. So I took some of the money that they had given me as an advance on the publication, and my husband and I went there about 3 weeks before I had to turn in the final manuscript, just to see if I had gotten it all right.
And did it affect the way you wrote The Mirrored World? Having been there, did you sort of change your view of things?
The weird thing about that experience was that it was exactly as I had imagined it. And I had spent, for The Madonnas of Leningrad, beginning to end, I had spent 10 years researching, reading, and looking at maps and photographs. And so when I got there, I really had to change, a couple of very small details, and that was it. The internet is a great tool. You can be an armchair traveler. So I think when I was writing The Mirrored World, the only thing that had changed because I had been there was maybe some better sense of the geography of the city that you can't quite get from the maps. But the new novel is set in the 18th century, so a lot of the city is just that was from the 18th century just isn't there anymore.
And much of the novel does deal with the sort of the haves versus the have-nots, which of course was very extreme back there in the 18th century. And you pepper the novel with a lot of historic references and historical figures. So talk about what you were trying to achieve with that sort of juxtaposition of those sort of different points of view of a country.
Well, I thought in some ways, 18th century Russia, it just couldn't be more foreign and bizarre and strange, and part of that was attractive to me. I think I write for the same reason that a lot of people read, and myself included, to be able to sort of time travel to a place that's very different from what you can experience. And you really couldn't get much more different than 18th century St. Petersburg. It's just very extreme, and as you said, this extreme and bizarre. The weather, these 9 months of darkness, and you have to imagine that kind of darkness in the 18th century before there was electric lights to dilute the darkness. And then the cold, there were accounts of winters in the 18th century that they said were so cold that the thermometers all exploded and birds dropped out of the skies. And then you had these characters. The novel spans the reign of the first three Romanov empresses, Anna Ivanovna, Elizabeth, and then the most famous one, Catherine the Great. And they were really extreme characters. Anna Ivanovna, for instance, she kept loaded rifles along at every window in the palace, so that as she walked down the hall, if she happened to look out a window and see something, she could grab a gun and shoot it. So they kept her parks stocked with Siberian tigers and peacocks, interesting things for her to shoot. And as I was reading all of these accounts, there was also Empress Elizabeth, who traveled a lot. She would go from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and also from the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to the Summer Palace, and then there was another palace halfway between the Winter and Summer Palace where they would sort of rest over on their way. And when she traveled with thousands of dresses, and with her furniture, and with a quarter of the population of St. Petersburg. So this is really extreme. But on the other hand, I started thinking, it felt a little familiar. They were the Russian nobility were our 1%. And the other 99% of the country lived in extreme poverty. And so I thought, even though this is a strange place, there's parallels that I think are particularly timely.
And in terms of your protagonist, Xenia, she is actually, I guess, a real historical figure. So talk about her a little bit, and how much is real in the book and how much is sort of made up by you.
All right. Yeah, there's the story actually follows two women, and one of them, Dasha, is the narrator. And I made her up out of whole cloth. The other woman, her cousin, Xenia, is loosely based on a historical figure, a Russian saint in the 18th century by the same name. And Xenia, the story of her, there's nothing historically documented on Xenia, but there's a lot of legend. And her story goes like this. She was a member of the minor nobility, and she was married to a singer in Empress Elizabeth's choir, and supposedly very happily married. When she was 26 years old, her husband died suddenly, and she went mad with grief. And she turned her back on a life of relative privilege on the fringes of the court, and became what in Russia is known as a holy fool. And
from there, well, it's a great novel. I mean, it really is worth reading. I mean,
I don't want to give everything away.
No, yeah, exactly. We probably shouldn't give it away because people need to go and sort of purchase it downtown at one of our local bookstores. Pop Book and News and Odyssey Books can always order books, and The Mirrored World by Debra Dean, I highly recommend it. But Debra, sort of looking ahead, is there another novel coming? And are we back in Russia again? Or are you going somewhere different?
I'm not going back to Russia. It was kind of crazy to do it once, and to do it twice seemed extreme. I'm very happy I did, but I think, knock wood, I think I'm done with Russia for a while. Although I don't know, I thought that the last book. So I do have a new book that I'm knee-deep in and really loving it. It is not a novel, though. It's a nonfiction biography. And I'm trying not to talk about it too much, but it is about 3 artists and their lives together, and it spans World War II, but in Europe, in Holland and Belgium and Paris, and then in New York, Greenwich Village in the 50s.
Okay, and for people who want to know more about you and about your books and so on, what about a website?
They can go to debradean.com. It's DEBRA.com. I'm sorry, DEBRADEAN.com.
DebraDean.com.
And I'm also on Facebook.
Okay, all right, so easy to find. The new novel is called The Mirrored World, and I highly recommend it, and you might want to take a look at the Madonnas of Leningrad too. And Debra, we will look forward to whatever comes next from your pen. So thank you again for joining me here on Artbeat.
Thank you, Karen.